It's Ash from Super Videos, back for another video for Season 8 of The Walking Dead. This is going to be my review for 809, the mid-season premiere for Season 8. So, let's just jump right into this. So overall, I feel like this episode was one of those episodes that was a good episode, but at the same time, I feel like they spent just a tiny bit too much time on Carl on his last episode. I know that he's a big character. He deserves like a big kind of farewell episode, but I feel like it was overplayed a little bit. I felt like it was dragged for a little bit. At least they could have just made the episode length a normal episode length. So that way it wouldn't feel that stretched out. But in this case, I feel like there was a lot of attention where it didn't really need to be there. Now, I'm going to emphasize this. I understand it was Carl's last episode, and he should have got a big goodbye, a big farewell episode. And he should have, had the time to say goodbye to everyone. He was still alive when he knew that he was going to die. I get all of that, but I feel like it was just stretched a little bit too much. What I really love about how they ended Carl's story and the last episode for him is how he had these one-on-ones with everyone. At least the people that, he was very close to, like Michonne, like Rick. One of the most gut-wrenching scenes from the episode was, the conversation between Rick and Carl. And obviously, Michonne thrown in the mix as well. And going further from there, what Carl told Judith, it was just, gut-wrenching. And I really think that they did an amazing job there. They basically made it so that by the end of the episode, when Carl actually killed himself, we basically were on with him on this emotional ride, with him talking to everyone he loves. Now, the other thing that I really liked that they brought back was Carl admitting that he killed the kid when he was surrendering. Because I think that was one of the lowest point that Carl has ever been in terms of his morals. So, for him to bring this up and confess to it before his death, I feel like was very interesting and it was done very well. But great performance by all of the actors, by Denaya Guerrera who plays Michonne, by Andrew Lincoln who plays Rick, and obviously by Chandler Riggs who plays Carl. Now, I would have loved to see a bit more with Carl and maybe someone like Daryl, because those two have a good connection as well. I don't understand how Carl got more screen time saying goodbye to Siddiq than he did with someone like Daryl. So that's a bit iffy for me, but I loved these one-on-ones that Carl had when he was saying his goodbye. And obviously, those scenes with Rick and Michonne digging the grave with the body there and everything, that was just done perfectly with the smoke in the back. And before I jump to the next thing, I feel like the final moment when we heard the gunshot that Carl killed himself is one of the most powerful scenes in the entire series. Because, you could kind of see all the emotion, all the pain going through Rick and Michonne's faces and their body language and everything as soon as that sound comes from the gunshot. So I feel like that's both great performance by the actors and also the way it was shot and also the way it was set up in terms of them being outside, Carl being inside the church, and the fact that it was all quiet and then a simple sound of thud just breaking everyone's hearts. That was amazing in my opinion. One of the most gut-wrenching and emotional scenes from the series, even though we didn't actually see Carl's death. Another great component of this episode was the reveal about the dream sequence or about the vision. So we got the reveal that this was not Rick daydreaming or imagining the future or anything. It's actually Carl thinking about what could have been if they never went to war, if none of this happened. And I feel like that reveal was a pretty good one. I feel like no one saw this coming. Obviously, I know there were some spoilers out there, and that might have been another spoiler that was out there, but it wasn't spoiled for me or anything. I only realized about it being a spoiler after the episode aired, which is a good thing. But the fact that they had that reveal in here, I thought was pretty cool. And, I'm almost glad that this was not real because the way Rick looks is just odd. If this was from a future, from the point in the comics that we have a time skip with the new beginning, I feel like Rick's appearance is all over the place or it doesn't really feel right. So I'm glad that they made this be somewhat of a vision, and that's why it looked so weird and unrealistic in a way. But the other thing I want to mention about this is Negan in the dream sequence. I was shocked and confused because it just doesn't make sense for Carl to daydream or have this vision of Negan in the future like that. It was cool to see Negan, I'm not gonna lie, but that whole setup was forced in my opinion. Now, I think that this was not really there in a way to show that Carl was thinking or dreaming or having this vision of Negan in the future being a good guy and living at Alexandria. I feel like this was more like an Easter egg for comic fans, because obviously for comic fans, if you know what happens after the war, that scene makes a bit of sense. Not that much, but you kind of get the reference, or you get what they're referring to from the comics. So I feel like that was more of an Easter egg than it was anything else. But the other thing that I thought was very cool is that Negan was gardening. And one of the things that I remembered or thought about after the episode is Negan's introduction. He said, "I'm not growing a garden," if you remember. So it's kind of cool that they had that in there with Negan gardening and him saying, "I'm not growing a garden," when he was first introduced. But also the other aspect of it that's very interesting is that, obviously Negan is responsible for Glenn's death, Glenn and Maggie and Herschel being the farmer. So it kind of all goes together hand in hand. But I feel like the other reference with Negan saying, "I'm not growing a garden," is the one that I found most interesting. Maybe that's not even what they were going for, but that's something that I found very interesting. But one thing that I forgot to mention is that I loved that kind of back and forth between Morgan chasing Gavin like a serial killer and Carl's conversation with Rick saying that they don't have to kill everyone, that there has to be a future. So I love that back and forth and kind of fed off of each other in a way. And the contradiction that was created there with what Carl was saying and what Morgan was doing. Now, before I move on to the next thing, in terms of Carl's death and the comic storyline, I understand what they're going for in terms of what they're trying to achieve, moving towards the end of the war that happens in the comics with Carl's death and Siddiq's introduction and him saying, "My mercy prevails over my wrath," and saying that he will honor Carl and everything. So I understand how everything is going hand in hand and how they're trying to push towards that end goal that they have to bring the end of All Out War from the comics to the show. But it's potentially wasting some of Carl's storylines from the comics. Now I understand that they can remix that storyline. That's obviously what's going to happen, or most likely what's going to happen. And it doesn't necessarily need to be given to one person. It could be split between different characters. But at some point, there's going to be some storyline that has to be remixed so much that it just doesn't have the same effect as it did in the comics. Now, that being said, there's kind of a trade-off going on here because I loved that whole trio emotional roller coaster ride with Rick, Michonne, and Carl. But at the same time, I feel like some of Carl's comic storylines may have been wasted this way. So it's kind of like a trade-off between the two. I understand what they're going for and I appreciate it and I love a component of it. But at the same time, I am a little bit disappointed that some of Carl's storyline may not be able to be delivered to the show the way it played out in the comics. We just have to wait and see, what happens, what they do with the storyline in terms of how they make Carl's death be a big part of what's going to happen next and the resolution of this all-out war. Now, moving on to the next big chunk of this episode, which was Morgan and Carol's mission to save King Ezekiel and the kingdom. I loved the whole thing with Morgan losing it and kind of moving more and more towards the edge and everything and losing a part of himself with every person that he killed. I loved that. And I loved that conversation with Carol and Morgan. Carol reminding him what he told her. And, trying to bring him back a little bit. But also the combination between Morgan and Carol was phenomenal. Not only did they both did an amazing job as actors, portraying those characters, bringing out those emotions and playing them the way they did, but also those two together are a deadly combination, which was pretty entertaining and and great to watch in this episode. And obviously, we saw that pretty insane scene with Morgan ripping the guy's guts out. That was just insane. And it just goes to show how far Morgan is going towards that direction of just losing a part of himself. But the last thing I want to talk about, which is one of the biggest things, is Henry killing Gavin. Now, I didn't see that coming. It was shocking to me. If you watched my reaction, you saw how shocked I was about that. That had two purposes. One was for him to see the way he was going was going to end up with people as pure as this kid killing someone in cold blood. So if Morgan wants to see a future where everyone's at peace and, you know, where they're trying to rebuild civilization, that's not going to happen with people like Henry growing up like that. So I think that was partially there to bring Morgan back. But at the same time, I feel like that was there as a way for Henry to kind of avenge his brother's death. Because obviously Jared was the one that actually shot Benjamin, but Gavin was the leader. The only person Henry has his hands on to get avenged for Benjamin's death is Gavin. So I feel like now that Henry has done this, he feels at peace, or he feels like he accomplished something. And also a very interesting cliffhanger that they gave us with that flash forward of Rick bleeding and everything and being injured. Now, I will do a standalone video on that. Stay tuned for that because that's going to be a long one. I can't cover all of it in this video. And plus, it has some spoilers from the comics that I don't want to reveal here for those of you that might be TV show only fans. But overall, like I said, this episode was a good episode. It was stretched a little bit too much, a little too much focused on Carl's death. But again, I understand that this was Carl's episode, his last episode. And for as big of a character as Carl is, his farewell deserved to be as big as it was. But that's basically everything for this video. See you next time for another super video.